pride of the fleet, how hubris and codebreaking doomed Japan at Midway. The vast, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean in the spring of 1942 was a chessboard of immense consequence, a theater of war defined by staggering distances and the revolutionary power of naval aviation. 6 months had passed since the Empire of Japan had struck a stunning blow against the United States at Pearl Harbor, a day of infamy that had galvanized a sleeping giant. In the ensuing months, Japan's rising sun flag flew over a new and sprawling empire. From the jungles of Malaya to the islands of the Dutch East Indies, Japanese forces had proven seemingly invincible, their military machine a marvel of speed, coordination, and ruthless efficiency. The Allied powers, reeling from defeat after defeat, struggled to find a foothold against the tsunami of Japanese expansion. But the tide, which had flowed so powerfully in one direction, was about to encounter an immovable object, a tiny coral atoll in the middle of the ocean named Midway. It was here, in the crucible of a battle born from strategic arrogance and a secret intelligence coup, that the course of the Pacific War would be irrevocably altered. The road to Midway began not with a grand fleet maneuver, but with a daring pinprick of an attack that struck at the very heart of the Japanese Empire. On April 18, 1942, 16 U.S. Army B-25 Mitchell bombers, launched from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, appeared in the skies over Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The Doolittle raid, as it came to be known, inflicted minimal physical damage, but its psychological impact was profound. For the Japanese High Command, and particularly for the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the raid was a deep source of humiliation. American bombers had desecrated the sacred soil of the homeland, proving that the defensive perimeter of the empire was not impenetrable. Yamamoto, a brilliant but often dogmatic strategist, became consumed with the need to eliminate the one weapon that had made the raid possible, the American aircraft carrier. His obsession would give birth to Operation MI, a plan of staggering complexity and ambition designed to lure the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle of annihilation. Yamamoto's plan was a masterpiece of intricate, almost baroque naval choreography. It called for the coordinated movement of over 150 ships, divided into multiple, widely dispersed forces. The centerpiece was a powerful carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, comprising the 4 veteran carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the very same ships that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Their mission was to neutralize Midway's air power, clearing the way for an invasion force that followed. A separate force, including light carriers, was to launch a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands off Alaska, hoping to draw American attention northward. Trailing hundreds of miles behind Nagumo, Yamamoto himself would command a main body of powerful battleships, including the colossal Yamato, ready to surge forward and destroy any American ships that survived the carrier onslaught. The plan was predicated on several key assumptions: that the American carriers, believed to be only 2, the Enterprise and Hornet, would be drawn out from Pearl Harbor to defend Midway, that the Japanese would achieve tactical surprise, and that the superior skill and experience of the Japanese naval aviators would guarantee victory. The entire operation was a massive gamble, a complex web of moving parts where a single failure in timing or coordination could lead to disaster. It was a plan born of what the Japanese would later call victory disease, an unshakable belief in their own invincibility. But as Yamamoto's Grand Armada prepared to sail, a silent, clandestine war was being waged in a windowless basement in Pearl Harbor. There, A brilliant but eccentric U.S. Navy officer, Commander Joseph Rochefort, and his team of cryptanalysts at Station Hypo worked tirelessly to penetrate the secrets of the Japanese Imperial Navy's primary operational code, JN 25B. Since early 1942, Rochefort's team had been painstakingly decoding intercepted Japanese radio traffic, gradually assembling a dictionary of the complex 5-digit code groups. They began to pick up signals of a major upcoming operation designated by the code letters AF. Traffic analysis and other intelligence pointed to the Central Pacific, but opinion in Washington was divided. Some believed AF could be in the South Pacific, or even on the U.S. West Coast. Rochefort, however, was convinced AF was Midway. To prove it, he and his team devised an ingenious ruse. Using a secure undersea cable, they instructed the naval base on Midway to send an uncoded radio message complaining that its fresh water distillation plant had broken down. A few days later, Station Hypo intercepted a new Japanese message, dutifully reporting that AF was short on fresh water. The trap had worked. Rochefort now had confirmation of the target. Further breakthroughs allowed Hypo to determine the date of the attack and provide Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, with a remarkably complete order of battle for the Japanese forces. Nimitz, a man of quiet confidence and decisive judgment, placed his faith in Rochefort's intelligence, a decision that would prove to be one of the most critical of the war. Armed with this priceless intelligence, Nimitz began to orchestrate his own ambush. He faced a daunting numerical disadvantage. He had no battleships to match Yamamoto's, and only 3 aircraft carriers to Nagumo's 4. The USS Saratoga was on the west coast, undergoing repairs. The USS Lexington had been sunk at the recent Battle of the Coral Sea, and the USS Yorktown had been grievously wounded in that same battle, limping back to Pearl Harbor with damage that engineers estimated would take 3 months to repair. But Nimitz needed every flight deck he could get. In a Herculean effort, 1,400 shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor swarmed over the Yorktown, working around the clock. In a mere 72 hours, they patched the ship's hull, repaired its flight deck, and restored it to a semblance of fighting trim. It was a miracle of naval engineering and sheer determination. On May 30th, the Yorktown, still trailing a sheen of oil, sailed to join the other 2 carriers, USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, at a rendezvous point northeast of Midway, codenamed Point Luck. Command of the carriers fell to Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard Yorktown and Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, who had taken over for the ailing William Bull Halsey aboard Enterprise. Nimitz's plan was simple and direct, a stark contrast to Yamamoto's elaborate scheme. He would concentrate his forces at the decisive point and rely on Midway's own land-based aircraft to act as an unsinkable 4th carrier, providing long-range reconnaissance and an actual striking force. The American carriers, hiding beyond the horizon, would wait for the Japanese to reveal themselves and then strike with everything they had. The stage was set. The hunters had become the hunted. As dawn broke on June 4th, 1942, the Pacific was deceptively calm. Aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo, confident of surprise, launched his first strike. 108 aircraft, a mix of Val dive bombers, Kate torpedo bombers, and Zero fighters, roared off the decks of the 4 carriers and winged their way toward Midway. The attack, which began around 6:30, was brutal. Bombs rained down on the atoll's 2 small islands, Sand and Eastern, targeting the airfield, hangars, and oil storage tanks. The small contingent of U.S. Marine Corps fighters, flying obsolete Brewster F-2A Buffaloes and a handful of Grumman F-4F Wildcats, rose to meet the challenge, but were hopelessly outmatched by the formidable Zeros. Despite the ferocity of the assault, the Japanese failed to achieve their primary objective, the neutralization of Midway's air power. The runways remained usable, and many of the American bombers had already taken off to attack the Japanese fleet. The Japanese flight leader radioed back to Nagumo, recommending a second strike on the island's defenses. This message arrived at a moment of profound indecision for Nagumo. His operational doctrine and Yamamoto's specific orders dictated that he keep half his aircraft in reserve, armed with torpedoes, to attack any American ships that might appear. But the attacks from Midway-based aircraft, though uncoordinated and largely ineffective, were proving to be a persistent nuisance. Beginning just after 7 o'clock, waves of American planes, B-26 Marauders, obsolete Vindicator dive bombers, B-17 flying fortresses, threw themselves at the Japanese fleet. They were cut to pieces by the disciplined anti-aircraft fire and the swarming Zeros of the combat air patrol. None scored a single hit on a carrier, but they had an unintended and crucial effect. They reinforced Nagumo's belief that the island's airbase was still a threat and solidified his decision, made at 7:15, to rearm his reserve aircraft with land attack bombs for the second strike on Midway. It was a fateful choice. The process of striking the torpedoes below deck and bringing up bombs was a time-consuming, labor-intensive affair that left the hangar decks of the Japanese carriers in a state of chaotic vulnerability, cluttered with ordnance, fuel lines, and aircraft. Just as this process was underway, at 7:40, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone, which had been delayed in its launch, sent a startling message: 10 enemy ships sighted. A follow-up message confirmed the worst. Enemy is accompanied by what appears to be an aircraft carrier. Nagumo was caught completely by surprise. The American fleet, which he believed was still hundreds of miles away in Pearl Harbor, was here, and it had a carrier. Panic and confusion rippled through the Japanese command. Nagumo's carefully laid plans were unraveling. He now faced a terrible dilemma: launch his bombers as they were, armed for a land attack, or reverse the rearming process again, a dangerous and time-consuming maneuver, to arm them with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for a naval attack. He hesitated. Then, at 8:20, he gave the order to switch back to ship attack ordnance. His carriers, their flight decks still recovering the planes from the Midway strike, were now a whirlwind of frantic activity, their crews wrestling with bombs and torpedoes, their decks crowded with aircraft. The Kido Butai was at its most vulnerable. Meanwhile, the American carriers had launched their own strikes. They came in 3 distinct, uncoordinated waves. First were the torpedo bombers. At around 9:20, 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron of the USS Hornet, arrived over the Japanese fleet. Flying low and slow without fighter protection, they pressed home their attack with suicidal bravery. The Zeros, like wolves on a flock of sheep, descended upon them. One by one, the Devastators were ripped from the sky by cannon and machine gun fire, trailing smoke and flame as they plunged into the sea. All 15 were shot down. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, clinging to a seat cushion in the water, a lone witness to the unfolding drama. Shortly after, Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, and then Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown, met a similar fate. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese carriers that morning, only a handful returned. Not a single one of their torpedoes struck a Japanese carrier. The sacrifice seemed to have been in vain. But it was not. The heroic, doomed charge of the torpedo squadrons had achieved something of immense tactical importance. It had pulled the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the defending Zero fighters, down to sea level, leaving the skies at high altitude completely exposed. And it was into this clear, undefended sky that, at around 10:20 a.m., the American dive bombers arrived. By a stroke of incredible luck, 2 separate squadrons, Bombing Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey, and Bombing Squadron 3 from the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell F. Leslie, converged on the Japanese carriers at precisely the same moment. Below them, the flight decks of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were packed with fully fueled and armed aircraft, preparing to launch a counterstrike against the American carriers. They were, in effect, floating powder kegs. The American SBD Dauntless dive bombers tipped over into their near-vertical descents. For the Japanese sailors below, the shrill scream of the diving planes was the sound of impending doom. Within the space of 6 minutes, the tide of the Pacific War was turned on its head. Bombs slammed into the Kaga, igniting massive fires and secondary explosions that tore through the ship. The Soryu was hit 3 times and was quickly transformed into an inferno. A single bomb, dropped by Lieutenant Richard Best, struck the flagship Akagi, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the crowded hangar bay among the fueled and armed aircraft. The resulting blast was catastrophic. 3 of the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier fleet were doomed, engulfed in uncontrollable flames. Only 1 Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, survived the initial onslaught. Escaping the carnage to the north, Yamaguchi, a fierce and aggressive commander, quickly launched a counterstrike. His bombers found the USS Yorktown. In 2 separate attacks, they struck the American carrier with 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes. The damage was severe. The Yorktown lost all power and began to list heavily, forcing its crew to abandon ship. But the Yorktown had absorbed the full force of the Japanese counterattack, saving the Enterprise and Hornet from a similar fate. American scout planes, however, soon located the Hiryu. In the late afternoon, a final strike force of dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, flying from Enterprise, took to the air. They found the Hiryu and, in a repeat of the morning's success, planted 4 bombs into its flight deck. The last of Nagumo's carriers was now a blazing wreck. Aboard his flagship Yamato, hundreds of miles away, Admiral Yamamoto received the devastating reports. His intricate plan had collapsed into an unmitigated disaster. With all 4 of his front-line carriers lost, he had no choice but to cancel the invasion of Midway and order a general retreat. The battle was over. The cost for Japan was staggering. 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 men, including more than 100 irreplaceable veteran pilots. The United States lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, which was finally sunk by a Japanese submarine on June 7th, while under tow, 1 destroyer and 144 aircraft, with the loss of around 360 men. The Battle of Midway was a victory of intelligence, courage, and luck. It shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility and permanently crippled the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force, from which it would never fully recover. The loss of its most experienced naval aviators was a blow that could not be replaced. In a single devastating day, the strategic initiative in the Pacific had passed from Japan to the United States. The long, bloody road to Tokyo would still be arduous, a campaign of island hopping and brutal attrition. But after Midway, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The high-water mark of the Japanese Empire had been reached and the tide had begun, inexorably, to recede.